Hello, everyone. This is Settlers Lament here, and I'm here with Charlemagne, the Distributist and Endeavour. And the topic of this stream tonight is going to be a right-wing critique of nationalism. So yeah, that's basically it. I imagine most people are mostly familiar with all the guests here, so I don't really think introductions are necessary. Um, but yeah, my main point with this stream isn't to say that nationalism is fake and gay or anything like that. As I imagine many of us in the right, I have relatively positive feelings towards nationalism, and it's certainly been a big thing for a long time, but especially for the past couple of years. But there's also certain issues with it that I have. Ways in which that I think to other right-wing goals, at least certain concepts of nationalism can be damaging, and I think it could be useful to explore those possible problems. Um, but yeah, so I have several topics that I'd like to get into. But is there anything anyone else would like to say to start out with?
It's certainly an interesting proposition you posed. It's kind of difficult for me to figure out how to approach this, since for me, nationalism is a pretty far to the right position in the modern political sphere. So it's a bit harder of a stream topic than I'm used to approaching. But I have done some reading that you could say does have this perspective, particularly radical traditionalists like Julius Evola, for example, is the standout one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'd say for me that like you, I'm very sympathetic towards the idea. I like the idea of the nation state, and I don't want to sound like, from my perspective, I don't want to sound like I'm counter signaling any of our guys, because I largely support the aims of what would be considered the nationalist movement, or that kind of anti-globalism thrust. I largely support the aims of it, and I definitely hope that it's successful. However, the question that's been on my mind lately is, to what extent will what the response to what we call globalism, or the cathedral, or whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, to what extent will that really represent the nationalism that existed, say, in the 19th and early 20th century? And I come to the conclusion that might actually be a bit of an outdated model, because things have changed so much since then, that the response to that may actually look very different. But I do think that the driving force and behind something like nationalism, that being tribalism and identity and culture, I don't think that's going to go away. I just wonder that in the modern world, how is that actually going to manifest itself? And I think it's going to be quite different. But we can get into that. We can get into that later if you'd like, though.
Yeah. Dave, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, I mean, I guess I have been saying, and I think a lot of people have been saying for a while, that nationalism is kind of a very limited framework to deal with the problems we're dealing with right now. It does feel like we're sort of using the cathedral 0.1, right? I mean, because it was, everyone knows this nationalism was a left-wing ideology in the 19th century. And not to reference Curtis Yarvin, like I do every stream, but he and a bunch of other reactionaries have been not the first to point out sort of the folly of the early nationalist movements, which were considered anti-monarchist in their concept. The one that Yarvin points out is the Garibaldi's takeover of Naples from the Bourbons, which in the 18th and early 19th century, Naples was considered to be the jewel of Italy. And if you go see it now, or really any time in the last 100 years, it's a mafia-run dump. And I know this is sort of a cheap shot in nationalism, but the problem with nationalism is it is fundamentally limited in scope. When I look at the current right-wing movement of quote-unquote nationalism, half of the people that I think is being very prominent don't live in my country. Even in this stream, I think aren't half the people here American and half Canadian.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you're running something that's just focused on the nation state, and your arguments are fundamentally particularist, that really limits the scope of your critique. And I think a lot of people realize that.
It's interesting what you mentioned there about the online space, because as you guys were talking, I was just kind of looking at our avatars, and I got the feeling that I feel much more political solidarity with you guys and other people we talk to than really anyone I could actually name in my local community that I would ever discuss politics with, which I think is a really good way of presenting the intrinsic problem we have right now with nationalism, particularly when you think of it in terms of this older model that you mentioned. It doesn't really feel workable in the real world. It feels like it only really exists in this cyberspace when we come together like this.
Yeah, because when you look at, say, the 19th century, the nationalist movements back then would have had a real authentic culture that they were that really was the unifying force behind them. So, the Italians, they all spoke Italian. The Germans, they all spoke German. They had like a unique culture, and that's something that like fundamentally differentiated themselves from, say, other groups. But today, kind of like we had mentioned, like, to what extent do Charlemagne and I have that much of a different culture? I mean, we're both from the Anglosphere, North America. Even though we're from different nation states, we kind of would say that everyone in kind of the distant right sphere is fighting the same battle. And, that really transcends the nation state, at least as it existed historically. So I think that you kind of have to look at it on a global scale, because the struggle against both against modernity, but also against kind of the political threats that we all perceive, is global. Like the attack against what we consider to be Western civilization and Europeans is global. So we can't really just see you can't really just see it in the context of a single nation state. So if you take say, for an example, today, a state like Hungary. Now, I fully support, the policies that they would be implementing, the nationalistic policies they were implementing. So someone like Viktor Orban. But at the same time, you have to also understand that, a country with 10 million people in a globalized world can't really go at it alone. Because if there's like all this weight coming from global entities and corporations, the UN, and NGOs and stuff like that, all coming down on this one, nation state in Europe, then that's really not going to win out in the long run unless there is a global kind of superstructure that allows, for that kind of for Hungary to preserve that, what makes it unique in that way. So, I would say I agree with Dave that you can't just limit yourself to a single nation state anymore, because the battle lines have transcended that, and that's happened for the last few decades, really.
That's a good point. I think one of the things that made me think about this topic for a while was the historiographical point that Dave brought up, which Moldbug talks about quite a bit. But it's very well known that nationalism was originally in the 1800s a left-wing concept, and Garibaldi, who you mentioned, who was generally viewed as the main founding father of the modern Italian state. He wasn't just like kind of left-wing; he was literally a socialist. He was a member of what later became the first Workers' International. Che Guevara was actually a huge fan of him, apparently. Though I just learned that in doing research for this stream. So that's sort of the first thing that sort of I think tipped me off that there is a bit of a problem with these issues and with nationalism. Though I think a sort of larger a sort of larger point is also how recent nationalism is. At least the modern concept of the nation state is more or less an invention of the past couple hundred years. Generally, historians will say the 1800s, but that's kind of reductionist. But it certainly is a relatively recent phenomena. I think the more primordial notion, though, is what Endeavour said previously, the concept of tribalism. where though it certainly is true that the modern concept of the nation state is relatively modern, the concept that people are a part of particular groups isn't. If I mean, you can go all the way back to the Bible, and there was clearly a very clear distinction of this group were the Canaanites, this group were the Jews, this group were the Egyptians. Those weren't like those weren't fuzzy boundaries. People understood relatively well what different groups were. And all throughout history, there's the people who were, of course, used in nationalist propaganda, people like William Wallace or Joan of Arc. And we certainly do see those in a sort of retroactive view in how they were refitted for 18th century nationalism. But that isn't just a lie to begin with. It's hard to actually just read the original source material for those two figures and not realize that this is getting at a sort of primordial tribalism, even if it doesn't fit neatly in with the 1800s nationalism perfectly. So, anyone like to say anything?
Well, I mean, I guess there's sort of two dimensions of the problem. The first one is the problem of designing a particularist right wing versus an internationalist left wing, and then the other one is sort of the natural history of nationalism and sort of the limitations that it poses that way. I don't know which one we really want to take on. It's hard to know exactly. I mean, I think it's just going to be a reality that globalized politics is here to stay. Now, what that actually looks like when the right wing interacts with it is going to be another question entirely. Obviously, I think the left wing imagines itself as being the only internationalist vision for humanity, and it counts that among one of its chief assets going forward. And that's been a continuing problem for the right wing, and it's going to be something that I think future generations or generations now actually are going to have to start building. I'm thinking largely of trying to do things like take over the slow food movement. That's something that's naturally a right-wing concept. And even making inroads with non-Western peoples like Islamic conservatives. This needs to be a vision that's extensive. And I don't think that, I mean, it doesn't have to be, I don't think one size fits all the way the progressives imagine it is ever going to be really the case. But I think that if it can't imagine a world operating, and then what happens is it's sort of a right wing that's sort of fundamentally always imagining an apocalypse and some kind of return to a past state of lower organization, which, like I said, there are global problems right now, right? And even if even if our conclusion is, well, look, we trade too much, we're embracing the wrong kind of diversity, we're making everything single point of failure, we have to stop this and recreate sort of local economies, subsidiarity, and particularity. That vision has to be something that works inside a global system for the times when global leadership is actually needed. And I don't think there's any way around developing that larger vision.
Not to bring up Moldbug again, but Settlers Lament and I did do a stream on his most recent article where he kind of presented this vision of the future that neither of us really found very compelling, which was this sort of a uber isolationist paradigm where nation states would enforce isolation globally with hard force, and we would all be just completely disconnected from each other.
Is this Neo-Segoku?
Yes, that's what it was called. And yeah, I think that is basically just the opposite way to be looking at our problems, even as a sort of thought experiment, because I think you're right. The reality is we live in a globalized system, and we really need to take internationalism and address it from a right-wing perspective that isn't simply some sort of attempt to negate it or go back to something else. We actually have to fully grapple with the idea of an international order from the right, as opposed to simply trying to avoid a problem that I think is unavoidable. There's simply no way to deglobalize the society or the world in a way that I can see making any sense. And I don't think that's simply a result of me being propagandized by, globalist politics. I think it's the reality.
And to go back to the analogy of Segoku, I mean, I think one of my main heroes of the era was the person who ended Sengoku, which was the Emperor Meiji, right? I mean, that was the right kind of change, right? The one that goes, okay, this is what our people need. Like, let's embrace this good thing. Let's reject this thing that would be poisonous to our society.
I mean, for me, I think that it's really important to make a distinction between globalization and globalism. So, because for me, globalization is a neutral term. It's more just describing the process through which the world becomes more interconnected. Whereas globalism, to me, is actually a ideology. Globalism is the forced homogenization of the earth, the intentional liquidation of traditional cultures and the replacement with them of liberal cosmopolitanism. To me, like globalism is things like the LGBT agenda,
Sure,
and stuff like that. Whereas globalization is more just a natural process, and I think that through the lens that is kind of something that is inevitable, that is globalization. You can actually think of ways that you can create a globalization that is more fitting to right-wing ends, and that actually creates a more stable and long-lasting society than the destructive globalism that we see today. And I think that's really the lens that the right wing should be looking at it through. And that can be one that includes the preservation of traditional identities and cultures and religions to the extent that's possible. But you can't really you can't just simply be a rejection of the entire process because we don't like the way that globalization is being done right now.
Yeah,
this
and
is sort of. Oh, go ahead.
globalization too. You can really look at it as an extension of industrialization. It's inherently the same problem people on the right faced 100, 200 years ago, even, and really we've yet to really come up with a satisfactory answer to this problem throughout all that time. It's always been something absurd like, say, fascism or National Socialism in particular. And really it's the left that has really maintained the initiative on responding proactively to industrialization and by extension globalization. And I think we need to realize that the right has just, we can't undo industrialization and we're not going to undo globalization, and we need to figure out how to address that from the right, which is just something we failed to do as a group for the past 100 years. And it's really going to require different ways of thinking and not this go back type of attitude that we've seen prevalent on our side of things throughout the last few hundred years.
I mean, I think we're already. I'm one that oftentimes says you can't recreate the language as you like, but since this is such a new distinction we're making, I think we really do need to come up with a third word for globalism that isn't almost identical to a natural process that no one can stop. Because this is like yet another word for something that we oppose that is aligned to a natural process that can't be stopped. And we have even more words for ourselves. That's just, the indication of trying to harken back to a previous age that can never come back.
Maybe neoliberalism might be a better term then.
Neoliberalism is slightly better, I think. I think it's still, I don't know. I think I've been calling that cultural homogenization or global cultural homogenization. The whole every place is starting to look more like LA. And this is something that I've realized, I bring this up to progressives. Some still understand what the objection is. A lot don't understand what this objection is. The fact that we don't want every place to look like some iteration of California.
Yeah, and that's a problem that Moldbug does touch on very astutely in the essay where he described Neo-Sengoku. And that is really what we're opposing. We're not opposing the idea of people being interconnected per se, but the seemingly inevitable side effect of the people homogenizing through some ideological means. That's what we really want to avoid. And that's what has happened, obviously, in certain nations like Japan in particular, through what you might call neoliberalism. So we really need to, I think the problem of nationalism on the right now is really a problem of preventing global homogenization.
Yeah. That's all very interesting. I think I think another issue that I have with nationalism is that's very common in nationalist movements is I think what you referred to as bulldog nationalism, Charlemagne, where it often can be a force to sort of reinforce existing structures rather than sort of seek the change that we want to seek. Um, because the issue with nationalism is it's fundamentally more or less supposed to be a love of your own nation. But I'm assuming most of us are very unhappy with where our nation is currently. So for a lot of people, at least, there's a big cognitive disconnect there between how can you claim to love something and want to change it radically. Now, I think those of us that know like traditional Catholic definitions of love might be able to explain that relatively well, but it doesn't help the fact that there's still a big cognitive distance there between claiming to love the nation and also claiming to hate where it is currently. So I think that's a pretty large problem with nationalism, where it often descends into the sort of boomer, America's great, America's perfect, that type of stuff, without realize, and it can reinforce sort of things like one term I've heard people use sometimes is gay bathhouse nationalism, where it's like I want America just as it is now, just without Muslims in my gay bathhouses. And I think that's sort of one of the big issues that I also have with nationalism. It can sort of freeze us into the current paradigm that we're in, without really looking at the broader issues that we're facing.
You go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you can go for it.
I think so. Part of the problem there, maybe to elucidate on that further, is when I think about America and loving America, and I think about America, it's America's really been on the wrong side of basically every war we've ever fought, right? We've always been the bad guys, and that presents a pretty tough challenge in how you go about loving that country. But at the same time, I can look at, say, the soldiers who in 1944 landed at Normandy and at D-Day and really admire and respect their individual nature and respect the personalization of the American spirit. So you can love your people and what your people are capable of, and not necessarily love what the state is doing. Say in the cases of the world wars, trampling across European civilization. So I don't have to love that, but I can also respect and admire the men who had the willpower to embark on such things. And the same thing goes for the exploration of the West, or you can pick from a million things that is great in the American spirit that you can love.
Yeah, I'd say that the phenomenon of what people refer to now as bulldog nationalism, I think that the problem with it is that it kind of separates the love of, say, a people group for it substitutes that for a love of liberalism. So it essentially views liberalism as the cause in which it essentially puts liberalism as the cause at which the West is fighting for. And it's derived from World War II, and for like Charlemagne had mentioned, I actually the images of Canadian soldiers from World War II resonates with me quite a lot. It's something that I really do have a great appreciation for. However, kind of the narrative that's been given to you is that over the last 80 years or so is that, well, it was a war for liberalism, and that you're proud because you live under a liberal democracy and you have feminism and gay rights and multiculturalism, and you fought against racism and stuff like that, which from a historical perspective isn't even really true. But that's kind of what's been given to you in the last 75 years. And to be honest, it does actually kind of reflect the society that exists today. And like you said, how can you really proclaim to have an affinity for your nation state in the present day when you're so opposed to it as it exists? It's a difficult question. I'd say that for that you'd have to kind of separate. You really have to make the separation between liberalism and I guess Europeans. You'd have to say that that's really what you are. You more appreciate European civilization and the culture and the history of that, and not liberalism, because you have to make that break in order to actually prevent the kind of liberal nationalism that is really kind of destructive and that a lot of people have been criticizing lately.
I wonder if that's not going to die with the baby boomers. I think that there's a few things I've been wondering, and the survival of this sort of neocon liberal nationalism has been one of them I've been questioning. I wonder if this is not going to get radically reconsidered, or if there's going to be a reorganization of political interests. I think from the right wing, fundamentally what we're hoping for is some notion of collectivism, where we can perceive our interests as larger than just the number of dollars we consume and the number of the quantiles of pleasure we get from these globalized supply chains. And we begin to see like, okay, I'm part of something larger than myself that extends into the future. And this has, well, I've been fond of using this word, this has historical and cultural context. So we are humans in context, and we are humans in a collective context. And I mean, really what we're talking about here is a rebirth of a collectivist concept of politics. And I think this sort of gets down to the question of identity. I've been critical of a lot of identitarian movements to this point, but at the end of the day, there's going to be no way of conceptualizing outside of the academy. There's going to be, or outside of right-wing academies, I guess, there's going to be no way of conceptualizing a collective identity or collective purpose without conceptualizing a collective identity. So that's something that I've been thinking about, and I don't know. I think this is a bigger thing than just nationalism for sure.
Regarding that idea of a collective identity, I do really like World War II movies, and I've been watching some movies recently made in Russia regarding, I forget the particular name of the movie, but it was crowdfunded, and it was about the defense of Moscow during World War II. And I'm really interested in finding more and more movies like this, because I think one thing I think Western people in particular might have a certain affinity for is just kind of appreciating the deeds of one another. And I'm reading The Storm of Steel right now by Ernst Jünger, and he shows a high degree of respect and admiration of the fierce English enemies on the opposing side. And I think that could potentially be a way for us as the West to collectivize, to simply look at our histories not as a conflict between each other, but all of us participating in this sort of great collective struggle of Western civilization. And I'm curious if other greater civilizations have that capacity. If you try to think about this happening from the Japanese or Korean or Chinese perspective, I wonder if they are really as capable of having that sort of perspective on the wars between each other.
I think that was largely something that was at least implicitly in Europe's historical concept of itself before World War I. I'm not so sure that after the total wars of the 20th century, we can conceptualize things that way. I think we can sort of look back on them in proper historical context and realize that these wars, first of all, history did not start with World War II, regardless of what is constantly implied in our culture. And, I don't know. I think that World War I and World War II sort of ended this kind of innocent perception of war in a really radical way. And I don't doubt that part of a new identitarian movement or a new identitarian, I don't want to say identitarian movement, because it's really more of an identitarian notion is more of an artistic and aesthetic concept than it is a movement. And any movement that tries to create it through political means is going to end up looking like total LARPers. But any aesthetic movement or any aesthetic cause that holds up a new identity probably is going to look back on World War I and World War II as conflicts where there was a lot of heroism on both sides. But I don't think that in isolation of something larger can be really held up. Those wars were just sort of fundamentally constitutionally different in a lot of ways. And I don't know. I think that you'd have to have this be part of some kind of new spirituality that could put this into context, right? Because as of now, right, like World War I and World War II aren't just wars that happened 80 or 100 years ago. World War I and World War II are like cataclysmic events that basically showed the world that the old order was totally incapable of ruling and a new order had to be brought in. Holding them up as like, noble causes where both sides had heroism and bygones are bygones is something that, again, if you had some new justification for an identity, I'm sure that would be part of it. But if you just do that in isolation now, it'll just be like, it'll feel like somebody who's trying to bring back, 1913, right? Or 1939, which is of course always the accusation from the left to the right.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is that you definitely don't want to get into the you don't want to fall into the camp that you're just the one who's trying to bring something back. And I guess that's kind of why, for me, I don't really like to, no pun intended, lament what's being lost, because I think that you're not going to really be able to put the world back together as it was in, say, 1939, and that includes like the differentiation between cultures that would have existed back then, because they didn't have this like globalized, homogenized culture that perpetuated itself through media and through education that we have today. And I'd say that instead, what you really need is kind of a right-wing version of that, because when you look at, say, these films that are released these days, these big cultural pieces, like maybe the new Star Wars film, it is something that's targeted at a global audience, and it's really meant to perpetuate the left's kind of cultural push globally. And I think that from the right, you really need something that's going to be able to do that from our perspective, and you have to be thinking globally in terms of that. You can't really be thinking about putting back together some kind of the how do you say it, unmixing the bag that's already been shaken up so much. It's more about creating something that as an alternative to what the left is creating right now.
I was mulling over what Dave was saying there regarding the world wars, and I think part of the problem is that we don't really have a conception of an international Western way of life, because for the most of the time that any sort of internationalization has existed in the West, we've been in periods of intense conflict with each other. And say you could stretch that from Napoleon all the way through the Cold War. The entire history of the West in terms of its international relations has only been conflict. So it's really difficult to look to the past at all to find any sort of means by which we would actually cohere into something that can actually persist itself into the future, as opposed to simply fight with itself. And you even see this still happening now with the European Union. We're still in conflict with each other, which I think is to our ultimate detriment, considering what's going on in the rest of the world. And there's really very little in history that we can use as a model that proposes some sort of way to actually act positively together.
Well, I'm not so pessimistic, I guess. I mean, I think, I see the crisis that we're currently facing down as probably the beginning of a lot of conflicts between different schools of internationalism. And I think it really just, what the right wing needs to do is just to find sort of the underlying ideas and more than anything else, underlying aesthetics and spirituality that really underlie its own brand of global vision for humanity. And I think that I don't want to sound too precious, but I do think this in some ways does begin with an artistic vision or some philosophical vision or some spiritual vision. I don't think it's there yet. I don't think that a lot of the pieces, and I think this is more of an opportunity than it is a crisis for the right wing, because I think that the right wing, as we're talking about it, the dissident right, not the neoliberal Buckleyite right. This is something that is fairly new on the stage in any kind of non-crazy or non-absolutely old and poor way. And so there's a lot of opportunities, and the opportunities, I think, begin with just telling better stories. Endeavour brought up the Star Wars movies. This internationalist period of pleasing everyone. Everyone can tell that this is crap. No one's defending the Star Wars trilogies anymore. No one's really looking forward to anything, with a few exceptions, on these Hollywood-produced movies. And I think the only ones that I can think of that are at all have any soul to them. One of them was Blade Runner 2049. And that was, to my mind, a reactionary movie. The villains were neoliberal internationalists. And it was obviously an analogy to neoliberal internationalism. Now, I think that makes it that's not enough to make it right wing, but you could tell that a lot of the people who just love Harry Potter and sort of, I don't want to call, I guess we might as well just call them the SJW crowd, the types. They didn't really know what to do with that movie. And I wonder if that's not going to be the same thing with what the director's next Endeavour, when he tries to take on the Dune movie. And not just that director, but really any director who wants to tackle something that has more of a tragic, more of a beautiful, a less internationally marketable dimension to it. I think they're going to start laying the groundwork for a different vision of how life should be, than how life is currently.
So do you think this aesthetic vision of the future for us, do you think it would have to be fundamentally Christian for it to really work, or do you think there's some other primary factor that would be necessary?
I think I'm going to kind of drop a bomb here. I think it fundamentally has to be more general than Christian. I think that it has to. Certainly, I think that there's sort of a trade-off in art where you can only go deep by getting particular. Great art always explores bad art always tries to swoop in from a bird's eye point of view and it tries to capture everything and lay everything out in detail and tell you exactly what the deal is with the world. And good art goes to the particular and then uses the particular to illustrate the things, the sort of the grander nature of the world. I kind of want to keep on going on this. Endeavour, you're reading War and Peace, right?
Yeah.
I've been reading that for about a year myself. I'm almost done, but life gets in the way. And people were talking about it. I forget if it was you or someone else who was saying, this sort of illustrates the aristocracy, like the nobility of the aristocracy, like their essential sort of heroic nature. Well, what's so ironic about this is that Tolstoy's thesis on War and Peace, his point of writing was actually to illustrate the exact opposite. It was to illustrate that, it's this association of heroic men in the universe, the Carlylean notion of heroism and hero worship. That's the problem. And, these aristocrats can't overcome their own internal flaws and they're constantly weighed down by them. But the thing is with Tolstoy, and he's such a good observer of character, and he observed aristocrats so much that his brilliance is that he's describing these people, and they're such fully realized characters that in the 19th century they would be notable for sort of their flawed nature, their failure to live up to the hero worship they hold up. But we read them in our degenerate age, and we're like, oh my God, these people are expressing nobility that I can't even imagine. So just by being, and Tolstoy writes this part of War and Peace. He writes this denouement at the end where he explains this anti-Carlylean theory of history, and it's kind of funny. It's the worst part of the book because he was talking. By exploring human nature just as a describer, he was touching on truth that was larger than he even knew. He built better than he knew. He wrote a book where you could see nobility, even in a book that was in some ways about collectivism, and I think that this is sort of the problem with globalized art, is that it can never describe anything honestly. And I think that what happens with a counter art movement is it has to just start describing the human form bleakly and specifically and narrowly, and then it has to draw out the particulars that pertain to all of humanity. And this is sort of the thing. Globalized art is almost forced to start too big, and it's forced to sort of obliquely layer on narratives. And when it obliquely lays on narratives, it can't honestly describe things in the particular at the local levels. So I know I've been rambling, but that's sort of what I'm thinking about. Like this is the ultimate fate of what globalized art is going to lead to. And it really we already see this in Star Wars, right? I mean, it's almost beautiful in how focus grouped and soulless it is.
Yeah,
zombie. Yeah, go ahead.
What I was going to say was that what you kind of see in the theme of what we want to call globalized art or global homo or whatever you want to call it, SJW art, is that its theme is really like breaking down hierarchies and dissolving traditional societies. What you see in Star Wars, it's from all like the meta politics involved in it. It's all about pushing kind of a anti-hierarchical vision. And I really think that the underlying theme for what would be kind of right-wing art that would be something that a globalized audience could appreciate, because you mentioned you probably couldn't only be Christian, because unfortunately the West is not actually as Christian as it once was, and
the language has to be more general.
What I was going to say was that I think that the underlying message really needs to be civilization and order and the virtues of things like hierarchy and the virtues of the transcendentals, because I think that that's really what people are kind of longing for, is order, really, and stability and kind of a vision for the future, and one that actually creates longevity. And I think that that's kind of a message that both the right wing can have politically, but also that kind of in the art world is something that really I think that's what people need to be focused on, because when you look at right wing art, War and Peace, for example, if we want to call that right wing art, I mean, it certainly would be considered that today.
Today it is, right? But yesterday, when it was written, it might even be considered left wing, right?
Yeah,
and it certainly is anti-liberal in a sense, because, well, I don't want to get into the details, but Tolstoy was a good enough describer so that what comes through is currently right wing, right? Because he's being honest, right? Go ahead. Sorry.
What you see though is that it's a very like hierarchical society that he's describing, but it's also one of beauty, really, and one that creates stability, and really one that in comparison to, say, the modern degenerate West, it really has a longer a much longer focus on things like longevity. So for example, what you see in the book is a lot of the concerns of the characters is their posterity and what's going to happen with their estate once they're gone, and their family name and their family's honor and stuff like that. Like, that's something that's completely
it's amazing, right? Like that immediately cuts into you, right? Like, as a modern person reading it, but it might not have cut into you when you read it in like 1900, right?
Yeah, the character that really resonates with me, and maybe someday I'll do a video on him, is Pierre. I just find him such an interesting character, because he's a aristocratic guy, but he just like his struggles with his own morality and kind of him trying to do the right thing. I'll have to obviously do a video on it. I can't really just describe him here, but it's just so it's just so much more interesting than one of these characters from one of these Star Wars films who's just fighting for freedom and equality against some evil bad guy. It's just so shallow in comparison. but I would like to
even mention Pierre and Ray in the same sentence from Star Wars.
It's insulting.
It's just a despair of everything.
Yeah, but I think I'd like to pass it to Settler's Lament because he hasn't talked.
Yeah, sorry, we're hijacking stream Settler's Lament. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I think the conversation that's going on is great. I don't really have anything to butt in on.
Well, that's why I think in terms of the art, in terms of right-wing art, in pushing a right-wing message, I think the message has to be civilization, really, and that's something that can appeal to everyone, even outside of the West. So someone from Japan can, though they're not exactly facing the same struggle, can definitely that's art that can definitely resonate with them because Japan is facing a lot of the same problems with modernity that we are. And then
go ahead.
Then I'd also add that, like, in the West, for the West in particular, I'd say that if you're for a more like identitarian message, I think it's best to appeal to the wider context of European civilization, because why is it that something like War and Peace resonates with me so much, or a film like Gettysburg resonates with me so much? It's not I'm not from Russia, I'm not from America, but just there is like a certain Europeanness to these works of art, which resonates with me on a much deeper level, and it kind of gives me an appreciation, not necessarily for a particular nationality, which I guess another thing we could talk about is kind of the difficulty we would have at fitting ourselves as kind of North Americans into a particular national context, but it's something that resonates with me on a more civilizational context than on a national one. And I'd say that that's really the appeal that the right wing can have in an artistic standpoint.
So the challenge I kind of wanted to put before people is, civilization, order, hierarchy. These are sort of, we talk about these a lot on the dissident right, or the reactionary idea sphere, whatever we want to call this. But I think that the challenge sort of is to think about the challenge, obviously, for us is that in a dialectic sense, you're never going to get into a debate with somebody over hierarchy. We all know that progressives are anti-hierarchy. We all know that when they're together, they talk about how they want to destroy all hierarchies, or flatten them all, or turn them upside down, or whatever. But they'll never get into a debate. They'll deny it in any kind of context where a dialectic with the right comes up, and say they just oppose unjust hierarchies. By unjust, I mean all of them. And the same thing is true for civilization or order. These are indeed the values that we're trying to instill and that everyone's sort of longing for. But at the same time, they're not going to be tools in any kind of dialectic conversation that you engage with people who are sort of opposed to them de facto. I think a bigger thing is just trying to inspire people to the fact that these things are important and present in their lives. When I would ask everyone in the chat, when did you feel like you were in a civilization? When did you feel like you would be comfortable in a hierarchy, even though the person who's over you is over you and has more power? When did you feel like order was a breath of fresh air, right? When did all of those things occur for you? And I think you'll end up answering a lot of the tasks that the right wing has before it. I would argue that most people feel most drawn to hierarchy when they witness heroism. And it's also what young men in particular are drawn to. And one of the key things that the left has discovered is it has created a narrative by which young men can pursue heroism. Ultimately, it's a false promise, but it's something that has allowed them to develop a base in youth that really the right wing has never been able to do. And I would argue that for civilization, it is that you feel like you're in a civilization when you experience a certain kind of beauty, one that comes from it comes from a collective that's sort of internal to your own identity, if that's not too convoluted.
Yeah, one thing that I've been interested in lately is looking at kind of the Disney films from over a decade ago, maybe the 2000s, the 90s, and maybe even a bit earlier. And one theme that I find really interesting is that when you look at like the Disney princess, who was kind of every young girl's dream in the 90s, it's appealing to the longing for hierarchy, the longing for status. That's kind of why, if you look at these Disney films, that's really where the kind of Disney magic that captured the imagination of so many young children came from. It's the idea of hierarchy and the idea of status. And I think that one of the reasons that a lot of these Disney films today feel just so inauthentic and so awful is that that was like their original magic, but then they have these egalitarian themes forced into them. So, when it's like, we need to have a black transgendered Muslim disabled princess, I mean, it completely deflates the original appeal of some of these Disney movies. And, you can kind of see in that respect that it's resonating with people on a much deeper level, but then it's kind of the politics of the present day is designed to essentially undermine the original appeal of that, and that's something I find interesting. That it's one of the Disney has become one of the major culprits of global homo, but then you don't have to even look that long ago that it was pushing what could be considered right wing or reactionary messages.
I was thinking about what Dave was saying there regarding order and heroics and looking for something that's called civilization that you would essentially want to be ruled by. And I actually I couldn't come up with an answer to that question. I don't think there's ever been a single moment really in my entire life where I think I've witnessed something genuinely heroic or found a person or structure of people that I would really want to be I guess subservient to. And this is actually a conversation I have with my brother very frequently. We're both sort of in this search for something heroic, for something larger than us, for something we want to exist in service of. And we're both struggling to find it really anywhere in some part of life that is actually real and not just on the internet. And I think this is probably a big problem with it's definitely a big problem with modern people, and probably one of the reasons why a lot of progressives don't recognize the orderly benefits of hierarchy, because they literally never witness it in their entire lives. They never ever find someone that you would describe as an aristocrat or is in any way heroic. They never see any heroic deeds. So how could we expect anyone to even have a conceptualization of what these things could be?
Well, I mean, we have at least. I'm not aware of your religious status, but keeping aside individuals that I've deeply admired in my own life, that feeling of being utterly humbled by a person's stature. People ask me a lot how I got from deism to Christianity. It was that feeling towards the historical figure of Christ that was sort of the final step for me.
Yeah, well, the problem is
in an emotional sense, right?
People are saying this in chat. Yeah, I understand what you're saying in an emotional perspective, but I'm talking about actually witnessing heroism in the real world, which is a thing that should occur, that has occurred throughout history, that people no longer really witness. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I thought about this basically the whole time you guys were talking, and I really can't actually think of any moment I've ever seen a person do something that I would actually describe heroic, which is, very unfortunate. And I think this is the case for most people, honestly.
I think you're right. I think that there's just, but it happens. It's true. I mean, there are a lack of obvious living saints in our time. By living saints, I mean people who are sort of saved before. This is a very Catholic perspective, but are sort of saved before the purgatorial fire, right? And I think that our age, they're either in short supply or they're very not visible.
Yeah.
And
I do.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Endeavour.
Oh, I was just going to ask if Settlers Lament wanted in on this. I don't want to.
Yeah, no, I guess I can add a little bit. I guess just to answer your question, I have somewhat similar feelings to Charlemagne, that I can't really think of anyone from my own life that I could really sort of submit myself to and follow like that. Though I mean, I'm a history nerd. That's really my biggest passion, even more so than politics. I just think it's harder to make a history channel than a politics channel. But like I'm reading a book on Joan of Arc right now, as I talk about her quite a bit. In like a proper academic book. The author is kind of an annoying atheist. So I mean, when I read about saints, both like actual religious saints and like just sort of secular saint figures, and other figures throughout history, there are many people that I've read about that I really do sort of get that feeling that I could. This is a person really worthy of leading. But there is vanishingly few people in real life today that I get that sort of feeling from.
The only people I can really think of that I would want to be led in any way by is people I've known in business. But to me, that's not a fulfilling conception of life. You know, there are certainly people who I would follow in terms of building a company. But, you know, I think that's kind of part of the problem with what I'm saying here is most of our modern conception of heroics is just making a lot of money and leading some silly business and nothing of a really higher spiritual value.
Yeah, you know, that's one of the themes that I touched upon in the video I made about the films Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. It's that I really because there are films about heroism, and you know, the masculine hero is a really big a really big theme in the film that really resonated with me, and I really thought it really made me think, like, you know, is there really any outlets in the modern world to really attain any kind of heroism for young men? I don't really think that there is, and you know, that's really is one of the things that I guess is really kind of depressing about our situation, is that you know, it's something that I think every man in some way longs for, is that responsibility, and you know, I just hope that in some way the right wing can actually offer that in maybe in the form of, you know, working towards order and working towards hierarchy and working towards structure, because you know, I think that people are longing for order more than most of all, because, you know, when you look at like you had mentioned, you don't really ever feel civilization. You don't ever really feel like you're in a power structure that you really respect anymore.
Well,
you know,
I don't want to interrupt you, but like, I mean, I think we can find small acts of heroism. I mean, I'm not saying that I found the new, not to copy her, I'm not saying I found the new Charles Martel or the new Charlemagne, but I think, you know, I have known people who have been spiritually more advanced than me and who I've deeply admired. And in just the whole idea of civilization, I remember when I walked into a concert hall, a very old concert hall in San Francisco, and I forget which one it was, but just like sort of the grandeur of it and the sound of the orchestra before it started. I remember thinking, when I first experienced that, maybe not first, but when I first conscious of experiencing it, right? I remember thinking, like, okay, this, what I'm experiencing now is civilization, right? Like, so many things had to come together to make that one moment possible. Like, every one of the musicians trained for years and years and years to be good enough at their instrument, and then in this one moment, they all come together. That I remember seeing. So, I mean, my point is, Endeavour, like these moments exist, right? I think we just kind of forget them. I didn't mean to use a vocal fry inflection with that, but we tend to forget them, right? And I think the reason why we tend to forget them is because our art elevates all of the wrong moments. Because everything about art is taking something that we all experience in our own lives and telling us, and I don't know where I'm quoting this from, that this moment is a holy moment, right? And so that's why everyone has like sex on their mind constantly. I mean, even people who are well past their adolescence, when everyone has sex on their mind, because Hollywood's constantly telling them that like the sex is the holy moment, like the orgasm's the holy moment, right? Like that's the holy moment. How many other holy moments are there, right? Like, definitely in the last Star Wars movie, like, when Admiral General Studies, when she smacked down the straight white male for flying his X-wing too recklessly, that was like a holy moment for that movie. But the thing is that these movies, our art frames all sorts. It either places heroism in a context that we cannot understand it, or it highlights moments that are altogether not heroic in their true nature. Like in the last Star Wars movie, I'd say most of the moments that it highlights are not very heroic in their true nature, or they don't really relate what we conceptualize as heroism in any way. And that's sort of the that's the problem, I think. That's sort of the problem that we're dealing with, or at least one of them.
I think you're right. I mean, there are certainly moments that I could say I experienced civilization in a microcosm, or there are certainly, I've seen people do admirable things, and deeds, minor deeds that had some sort of heroic element to them. But so that definitely exists, and you're probably right that we tend to pass over these things and don't notice them quite as much as some sort of grand deed. So I don't think it's I don't think the case is quite as blackpilling as it sounds. But at the same time, I still would hold that I think there should be able to exist some type of person who I would admire in some sort of holistic sense and view as a hero themselves, rather than simply observing one or two minor deeds that someone may have done in the past. And I can't conceive of that person existing in the modern world.
I think a large part of the issue is the sense of duty that just doesn't really exist in the modern world, for at least in the modern West, in a lot of senses. And there are there are actual living saints sometimes, but they seem to be relatively rare. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago there were, I believe, 2 Catholic priests in France that were martyred by some ISIS terrorists. So it does happen sometimes. But generally speaking, just the sort of willingness of people to actively go to their death is something that seems very far away from us. And that might be the most extreme form of heroism. But still, I remember one quote in particular that has always really stuck with me since I was in high school. Of just a biography I was reading. It wasn't like a super in-depth book. It was a popular sort of it was just like a popular history. But it was just talking about some random admiral. It wasn't what the book was about, but it just was talking about World War I, and talked about some random admiral who his ship was going down. It was just a throwaway line in the book, but it said that he went down with his ship as was the custom in the day. And I just remember it really shocked me that I had a basic understanding of captains going down with the ship, but the idea that a guy would just give his life like that when it wasn't even mandatory, when most of the other people managed to escape the ship, that sort of thing just seems so utterly foreign and absurd to, I think, the modern Western mind. And I think that lack of duty, which would have been considered inviolable to many people in the past, that sort of disconnect is a big part of the issue that we have.
Yeah, and likewise, like I mentioned earlier, I'm reading The Storm of Steel right now, and just today I had read a line where Ernst Jünger talked about the supreme joy, basically, of facing death with 100 other men who you're there commanding, and they all want to be commanded by you, and you're experiencing this great challenge you have to surmount together, and you all want to surmount it together. And I just think about, if only I could experience 1% of something like that in life, but I don't even know how I would get that.
Yeah, earlier this year, Morgoth had made a really good video about Iran, and a comment that was made when the United States had bombed Iranian targets in Iraq and killed the General Soleimani, or whatever his name was. a comment on Iranian TV said that if they were to kill an American hero, who would they kill? And they sarcastically said, who are we going to kill? SpongeBob, Spider-Man? Like they don't have like America as it exists today. And this is true for the entirety of the Western world. You don't have this one like figure that their death would be considered a national tragedy in the same sense that this general was for Iran. I mean, the only example you could really think of is maybe like Queen Elizabeth or maybe one of these other monarchs in Europe. But and again, that's largely just a even that's kind of losing its luster. So you see that we really kind of do lack that heroic archetype. And one thing I think is that what we've really had the idea of heroism and of virtue really flipped on its head, in that it's almost like weakness is now considered heroic. It's like the overweight black woman who has like who's I don't know disabled or something like that is a hero because she's been given an affirmative action job to work in HR, and she's a hero because basically she's the lowest of the low, and that's heroic. And it's really just like a complete inversion of what the kind of heroic archetypes that actually appeal to people. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying, that the Disney princess who's like the diversity hire, it just completely ruins the entire appeal of it, because it's trying to force something of very low quality into a position which you associate with quality and you associate with virtue and goodness. And yeah, we've almost I find have had that flipped on its head, that it's really like whoever's the weakest, whoever's the most incompetent, whoever's the biggest victim is now considered to be the most virtuous in some ways.
Yeah, that's something I've picked up on as well. Basically, the idea of heroism in film has been completely inverted, where weakness really is what is held up as the ideal. The weaker someone is, the better they are. They're more moral for being weak rather than having some sort of inherent strength in them. And it's a really perverse thing that happens. And I do recall the Spider-Man thing. I thought that was a really salient point made there. And I think my mind went to Clint Eastwood as far as who the hero who could be killed was, and he's not even a real person, really, in the sense that I'm thinking of his characters, not even of the man himself. And I think that that point there really hits home, and is probably more effective at demoralizing Americans than actually killing any particular person. To think that there's not even a single individual in the whole society who could be killed and have it cause some sort of distress for most people.
Yeah, that is quite distressing. I do kind of, I feel like we have kind of hijacked Settler Lament's stream, right? Like we were talking.
I think the conversation's really good.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, just to relate this back to sort of nationalism, I think the difficulty with national projects as they exist right now. So if we look at the left, this is something that David Hines talked about a little bit. Let's say you're like a young guy, and I saw someone in the chat saying like, well, what do they say? Restoring the sexual hierarchy or sexual gender roles would be like the key attractor for young men on the right. Actually, that can't be done. It can't be done. Like you can't tell women, respect gender roles if your men aren't given an opportunity to prove themselves. Successful movements give men opportunity to prove themselves. Which is why young men look for their vocation. They look for something they can believe in and fight for when they're young. And that's something that the left has been good. If you're a young man and you're coming to the left going like, I want to do something really radical and extreme for this movement to show how dedicated I am, there's always a really ready-made answer for you. And as David Hines pointed out, there really isn't for the right. And I'm not so sure what the answer is for nationalism. I feel that any kind of international right-wing concept or aesthetic movement or cultural movement or academic community would have to have an answer to that question. There would have to be some kind of right-wing activism you could do that wouldn't necessarily immediately confer heroism, but would give you the opportunity to do things that stand out, where one could demonstrate something about themselves without having to do something crazy or do something that's destructive.
Personally, I think something like community gardening would be really good in this aspect. I really enjoy.
I absolutely agree. Yeah,
I enjoy gardening myself in my backyard, and I think it would be really great if there was some sort of communal area where people could gather and accomplish something completely cooperatively in nature as well.
I think hijacking or controlling the slow food movement would be like, that kind of thing is very achievable for the right, especially if it links up with the right-wing movements.
Plus, we enjoy it, right? It's important to do something you enjoy, and that's what David Hines points out as well in the same series you cited. We have to think about things we actually want to do and not just something for the sake of the political nature, because if it's not fun, then you're just not going to get enough people on board with it. And plus, people who aren't already on your side aren't going to want to do something that's not fun. If you're growing a really cool garden and people see you as a community, doing this in public, they're going to want to join you and, share in the fruits of your labor.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. This is something, and I think nationalism can play a role in that, right? But I think it has to be something that extends beyond our ordinary notion of nations, because the only way you can be an activist for a nation is, well, obviously the typical right-wing avenue is military or war, but these days it's basically lobbying and political activism, of which is, I don't know, I mean, we could get, this is a whole other rabbit hole, but this is the whole nature of how that works in a democratic system. It's sort of fundamentally the same kind of hierarchy of victim mentality that we're complaining about right now.
Yeah, I don't find actual politics of any particular interest to me. It just kind of seems generally slimy and anti-heroic. I don't really think doing much at all in that domain is something that I guess right-wing youth who are interested in the concept of nationalism should be doing.
Well, you mean like government social justice? I mean, you mean government progressive type activism where you're like lobbying for something
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it just seems kind of gross inherently to me.
It's gross how it currently works.
Yeah.
I don't want to rule out something in the future that could be reformed. It's
obviously politics exists, right? And we have to engage politics, but it just seems like the way politics are currently done is just completely at odds with the way people our nature want to behave.
So someone asked me what was missing from the Benedict option just yesterday, and I couldn't come up with a sentence that described it. And I think you just said it right there. Politics exists, and we had to do politics.
What I don't like about the Benedict option is that it just basically says retreat and don't ever engage in wider society. And to me, that's the completely wrong way to go about it. Like, the idea that you're just going to be allowed to retreat and have a traditional society, within the wider context of the globalized world is really delusional. And I guess that kind of goes back to the point we made earlier that an individual nation state can't necessarily survive on its own in the globalized world without kind of a wider support network from other countries. That you don't want to get into the idea that you can just retreat into your own country and have and just be essentially have like the 1950s back, where you have like your traditional nation state, because that's just not going to happen.
I'm actually you, Endeavour. The Benedict option doesn't say retreat into your own little communities and do nothing politically and do nothing as your opponents consolidate power. It just says maybe retreat into your own communities, maybe do nothing, and maybe just stand idly by while your opponents consolidate power. That maybe is like the key get out clause. Like it might want you to do politics as your opponents move in to crush you, but like we're not gonna talk about that, right? Because that's alarming. That's right. I'm ragging on Rodri here.
I guess like the way you tie that to nationalism is that, like, in order to you do need to have individual nation states or countries as they exist today, or even if you had a better situation in, say, a country like Hungary, you still would need to engage in the global politics in the same way that that liberal democracies in the globalized world do today, because you'd have the same problem that you're essentially ceding the ground while your enemy really encircles you, and they're not going to allow you to exist in any way that threatens them if in your own kind of world like that. So I guess the way that you tie that back to nationalism is that you do have to engage in the politics globally. And there's plenty of good ways to do that. Like, for example, I do find that the meta politics that the left is pushing is global. And I think that the meta politics that the right wing needs to push should be global too. Like, and it's a lot easier with the memes we have today. Like, for example, the "it's okay to be white" meme, that's like wreaked havoc against the cathedral, if we want to call it that, across the Western world.
Though, right? I totally agree with you, but like that's like a great repost. But like, "it's okay to be white" is like, it's basically like Home Alone, where like the stupid robbers are coming in and like Kevin sets up the microwave machines just right so they all like fall flat on their asses, right? Like, it's not an actual like cultural move. It's just a really brilliant defense that our opponents are stupid enough to walk right into, right?
Well, the point I wanted to make though is that the meta politics of the right, because that's like a very it's a very it's a very primitive form of meta politics, just meta politics, like the "it's okay to be white" meme, because the left is doing this too, and I don't know how much I want to get into it, but something that's meta, an example of meta politics being pushed is, if you look at these advertisements, it always seems you see the same combination of man and woman. It's always like a black man and a white woman in the advertisement. What that is meta politics being pushed, or the fact that you always see.
Well, it's a culture jam, right?
Yeah, it's inserting an idea. It's deliberately inserting an idea into the culture, but it's not doing it just one country. It's trying to do it globally, because that's where these advertisements go. Or seeing like the LGBT agenda forced into absolutely everything. That's meta politics on a global scale. So when you see I'm not a fan of soccer, but I was at a bar and I saw a few months ago, and I saw a soccer game, and for some reason it wasn't even like June or anything like that, the LGBT month, but while they were singing the national anthems, there was somebody there waving a giant rainbow flag, and it's like, what does this have to do with this soccer game? And the answer is, it's meta politics being forced into everything. That symbol of the rainbow flag is a global push of meta politics. And what the right wing needs is certain memes and certain memes are like the very rudimentary level, but then certain ways to push meta politics on a global scale, and that needs to transcend nationality. Really, like the "it's okay to be white" meme was a really a basic example of that, and that's really how I think that right wing ideas can really make an impact. It's through meta politics.
Yeah, and that tends to occur, I think, most effectively in film these days. And one of the problems there is people tend to only watch really high production movies, and we have no inroads whatsoever on the film industry. And what tends to happen is we often will co-opt something, I suppose, for our purposes, like Blade Runner 2049 and perhaps Dune, and maybe that's effective in helping to spread a meta-political message. But how do you guys do you think there's any hope for us in producing films in terms of spreading some sort of meta-political message, or perhaps some other medium like video games?
I don't think it's through the big publishers, because they're not going to let you in on that. They're not going to like allow you into Hollywood and deliberately make a right-wing film. I think that but I think that the internet kind of gives you so many opportunities, that there are so many more opportunities now to create art that doesn't necessarily need to be big budget, doesn't necessarily need to go out to millions and millions of people. Like, you can reach a small amount of people, but on a very low budget through the internet. You can there's been these Warhammer 40K movies that have been made just by fans on the internet, and these things have very right-wing reactionary themes in them. And I think that with the mainstream culture being so stale and so uninteresting now, there's a big opportunity to use the power of the internet to kind of create to try to force meta politics through creativity over the internet. But I don't think you're going to be able to get the big developers, at least not yet.
Yeah. My thoughts on this tend to be too that video games are a lot cheaper to produce and end up with something that people are actually going to want to consume. I can think of far more examples of very successful cheap video games over cheap movies. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Devin Stack, someone had mentioned in the chat that he's actually making a movie of his own, which should be interesting. I would like to. It would be interesting to see more attempts at right-wing art. I've thought about it myself, but I don't know how good of a writer I'd actually be. Maybe, but a lot of people in things like film school and maybe a lot of writers who perhaps have right-wing leanings, but are too afraid to air them for fears of their career. It would be nice to actually have something in place that we allow them an outlet of expression. But I'd like to hand it over to Settler's Lament, because again, he's not getting in much of the action on his own stream.
Yeah, no problem. No, yeah, I think art. I think it's a sort of really common issue with the right. Is the personality type of the artist is generally a left-wing personality type, and most people that are really interested in politics on the right, that's what they're skilled in, is politics or maybe business or something like that, but not really not the actual medium of art. And I think artistic expressions could be one of the most useful ways of pushing our message in various formats, whether it's sort of amateur films on YouTube or something, or video games. But there just seems to be a really lack of people that could actually get on the right that could actually get that done. I think we should, if there is anyone that could actually do something like that, we should try and help them out. But I mean, I'm not artistic at all. I can't, I don't know, draw or paint or whatever, or make an amateur film, and I don't know, writing's the only thing I have any skill in whatsoever, and it seems to be pretty common on the right. And yeah, I don't know how exactly to get past that issue, because it is a very valuable medium. But I am not really sure what to do about it.
Yeah, well, one thing that I think has actually been kind of successful is that you'll see a lot of these bigger nerd channels on YouTube, which aren't even really political. And I'm not a huge fan of these channels because I try not to get too involved in nerd culture. But one thing you see is that a lot of them kind of have absorbed right-wing memes through the kind of meta-political work, and a lot of them will just spout them off without actually thinking too much about it. So you might get one of these nerd channels making a reference to, I don't know, the Great Replacement or something like that, or one of these right-wing memes, and what that really is meta politics in work. It's kind of the memes that originated kind of in our sphere of the internet, and have kind of leaked out into a more broader, a more broad realm that's not less politically oriented, but at the same time is quite culturally influential. And that's actually it's a good sign, because you do see that a lot of the ideas that are coming from the right wing are actually kind of making their way into the wider narrative culturally. And a good example of this was I think that was the Groyper Wars in last year in October and November, was really kind of forcing these dissident right-wing talking points and bringing them into mainstream politics. I think that is actually kind of a very effective way for the right to actually get a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, to bring them into kind of the more public consciousness. It's kind of through the leak of meta-politics and memes and the internet, and kind of just trying to get these ideas in there through kind of cultural osmosis.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess so. In some way, the answer is just keep making stuff, just keep pumping out memes. Maybe if you're streaming video games, there are a couple of famous moments that have leaked into the culture that way, like we all know the infamous PewDiePie scene on the bridge where he said a certain thing, and that kind of became a meme in itself. And I'm sure you guys can think of other examples as well.
Well, I would say that I think memes. The right wing is. By all means, do it if that's your medium, if that's your MO. But they rely on the mistakes of your enemies more than they do the value of the art itself, and they don't last very long. PewDiePie is become a right wing figure because the left is an idiot. He's not particularly right wing, and speaking of another idiot, kind of comparable to PewDiePie, there was the whole iDubbbz thing. These things are red pilling people, but they're not. Unfortunately, they're not actually by the virtue of any message the right's put out. They're just because the left is so intrinsically disordered that it can't even get its own story straight.
Yeah, I do agree that eventually you do need high culture. I mean, you can't. Memes are really just kind of the most rudimentary level of cultural creation. Eventually, you do need actually much larger mediums, but it's a matter of working your way up to that, I guess. And getting the funding for it also.
Yeah, that's of course another very large problem in of itself. Which we discussed last night, I think, on Clossington's stream. We talked about the need for money on the right wing, basically, and I think this problem kind of ties into the problem of getting our narratives into the political sphere. Something like what the Groypers did. Perhaps if we continually use tactics like this to sort of force certain narratives into the mainstream, we can attract attention from potential donors who might support some large scale film project or something like that.
Yeah, it's actually, and in the case of the America First ones, that actually was pretty successful. That it actually got a lot of bigger people on the side of America First and away from conservative Inc. Like you see people like Michelle Malkin flipping. So it was an effective strategy, definitely, to get some of our ideas into the discourse, I thought. But again, though, you can't only rely on the same strategy. There are other things you need to do as well.
So to sort of segue back to nationalism, I've gotten the impression that people in England are a lot more optimistic than people in North America on the distant right. Do you think they're just at an earlier stage of this whole Trumpian backlash moment, or is something about their situation different?
Well, over the last year or so, or the last few years rather, they've always been a little bit ahead of North America in terms of
ahead or behind.
Things are happening before they happen on this side, so they're in the future, I guess, from our perspective, by maybe a year or so in terms of their meta politics. Like Brexit came before Trump, for example, is the big one, but I just find that's generally the case with their politics. You were going to say?
Oh yeah, I'll let Settlers Might go.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think the situation in Europe is a lot more encouraging in certain places. In the UK, in particular, has a lot of problems, largely due to their electoral system. But you have a lot of places in continental Europe, like Italy with Lega Nord or Spain with Vox, where you have parties that are much, much more right-wing than what we're generally used to, getting very large percentages of the vote, and possibly becoming governing parties sometime soon. Salvini in Italy looks, at least before the recent crisis, looked very much poised to become the next prime minister. The UK, I think the main reason for optimism there is just that in certain ways the situation isn't quite as advanced there. though I really don't see the sort of backlash that exists in continental Europe being replicated there at this point yet. Hopefully, things can improve into the future. But currently, despite the sort of boomer Brexit stuff, it doesn't really seem like it's moving that far beyond that currently, at least.
Yeah, I'd say that there's several advantages. That one of them is they do have a meta-political advantage in that the left's narrative, what the left has kind of tried to do is transplant what they did in North America and implant that onto the UK, and they're going to try to do that in the rest of Europe too. That's kind of the what I kind of say is that it's kind of the globalism package. The process that they use, but there you see it doesn't work as much because when somebody says that America is a nation of immigrants, I mean it's technically true, but it's taken out of context because the truth is that it's a nation of European settlers, so it definitely is not. It definitely was not what the left in say 1776. It was not what the left is envisioning today. But, in the UK, when they say that the UK is a nation of immigrants, anyone who's not, Owen Jones knows that that's just an outright lie. So, it is much easier in that sense to undermine the left's narrative. And also that, in the case of America and I guess to a lesser extent Canada, the kind of multiracial issue has always been there, in America with slavery and stuff like that. So it's much harder to actually advance a pro-European agenda. But then in the UK, like you can just say that 50 years ago it was not a problem at all. Now it's been made a massive problem, and it's much easier to get people to distrust that, I guess. And then also, I guess if we're discussing nationalism, there is a longer ethnic history of the UK than say in North America. So it's very easy to tell, like, what a indigenous British person is versus what a European American is, or like, because what you get in Canada or America is that most people have been there, maybe 100, maybe some of them 200 years or so. But and it's hard to tell, like, exactly. Say, white Americans aren't really a unified ethnic group in the same way that English people would be in the UK. So they have a lot of advantages in that respect. And also, I'd say that maybe the demographic situation isn't quite as bad. But one thing, though, and the other thing is that it does seem that the state is panicking a lot more, because it seems that the state seems a lot more authoritarian than in America and Canada. So I'd say that there are a lot of advantages there, but
the fact that narrative works at all is kind of depressing.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's much easier for them to poke holes in it because it's just so obviously a lie, and like no one in their right mind actually believes it. So I'd say that definitely they have some advantages in that respect, but maybe, I guess, to give some optimism for North America, maybe they're just a little bit ahead of us, and maybe a lot of kind of the things that are happening there will become more mainstream in North America. At least that's what I hope. Maybe more organization, more getting our act together. Because I have to say that the UK scene actually does look very good. It does seem like everyone's working together. A lot of them are generally on the same page, and they have their talking points, and it seems like they're making them. They're actually getting them into the discourse. I hope we can see that in North America within the next 3-4 years. So I am hopeful that we'll be able to kind of turn that same corner.
Well, another advantage that exists in Britain is their problems tend to be concentrated very much in London and this one massive problematic city. Whereas on the North America side, particularly in the United States, we have a multitude of massive hotspots of completely different cultures, really. I mean, the West Coast cities are a lot different from the East Coast cities, and all of these urban centers are extremely problematic in their own right. And you don't really have the same problem in Britain as much, insofar as having so many different places that are just massively corrupted.
Yeah, and I guess in Canada, what we'd have is that 50 years ago, what the divide would have been Anglo-Canadian and French-Canadian. And you see that is kind of one of the daggers that they have, is that they kind of use that to deconstruct the entire idea of Canada really having a European identity. So they'll say, well, we've always been multicultural because we have French and English heritage, and then Native Canadians. But then the problem is, like, anyone on the right wing who's astute enough knows that the left doesn't really care. They basically want to just deconstruct anything that's European. It's not about it's not about an honest assessment of what Canada was, several decades ago. So, I think that in that way, I'd say that my focus is a lot more on kind of creating something new, because, the problem we really have is that, at least in North America, it's not as long of a history. So you can't really draw on that long. You can't really draw on, I guess, the spiritual strength that they would have in somewhere like Europe. And, in many ways, the Canada that existed, say, in 1965 doesn't really exist in any real sense anymore. So, I mean, I'm more just, for me, and I guess this might actually be kind of go back to nationalism and why some of the problems with the idea is, like, I love the idea of nationalism, but, what am I really a nationalist of? Like, I don't really have a nation state that exists today that really resonates with me in any real sense. So I'd say it's more kind of focusing on creating something new. That's kind of the perspective that I come at it from.
Yeah, and for me on the North American side, I mean, any distinction between Canada and America at this point in terms of the government are kind of meaningless to me. I don't feel any more particular solidarity to to the Distributists than the two of you because of our particular country. I think because we have such limited history, I don't really think the boundaries between us are quite as important.
Hey, I married a Canadian. That wasn't a joke. That's
I know.
a remark.
Yeah.
Well, it was funny.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Settlers Meant wanted to because you had said something about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What did you ask?
Oh no, it's that I find, like, a lot of the tradition. I guess one of my reservations about nationalism is that, I guess, you in the North American context, you don't really have that framework there to really be nationalistic for. So it seems like in our context, it's much more about creating something new rather than actually preserving something with a very long history.
Yeah, I mean, Canada does have an relatively ancient history. Just European Canada does go back about 500 years. That's not nothing. But the issue is that since 1965, for non-Canadians, the reason that year is relevant is because that's when the Liberal Party destroyed our traditional flag. But since 1965, our Anglo-Canadian, especially history, has been completely destroyed. And there would have been a point when Canadians would have had a relatively strong connection to their history, at least as strong as any other Western ethnic group. But that's just really been completely undone in the past 50 or so years. It's as Trudeau said, Canada is the first post-national state. That's probably the truest thing he's ever said. That is a very large problem with Canada, and I think that's why the situation is probably more advanced in Canada than any other Western country, because just Canada feels, the entire country almost feels like a hotel. It doesn't feel like that there's really anything that we're rooted towards. What Endeavour was talking about earlier, the sort of trick that the left plays, that because we had 2 or 3 founding ethnicities, then that means that we might as well have infinite ethnicities or infinite cultures, multiculturalism. which it's obviously ridiculous. All countries have multiple cultures, multiple ethnicities, but the difference between 2 or 3 ethnicities or cultures and infinite ethnicities or cultures is a infinite distinction. But that's sort of the way that that multiculturalism was brought about in Canada. It actually started initially with a program called biculturalism, and then that morphed into multiculturalism.
Yeah, I guess another thing would be the kind of rootedness that really traditionally was involved with nationalist movements, is kind of the connection to a land. And I love the idea of being connected to a particular plot of land. But if I had to be real honest, I mean, I lived the first 24 years of my life in North York, which is a district of Toronto. I don't feel any connection to it at all. Like it essentially is meaningless to me. I wouldn't really not have any reservations about separation or things like that, or creating something a completely new state out of the modern borders of Canada. Not that I think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's something that I'd fully be willing to embrace. So in that sense, I don't really feel like I guess that I really have any. I don't think I as much as I appreciate our heritage and I appreciate our history. I don't really feel any affinity to the country as it exists today. So I guess that in that respect, it's kind of hard to use nationalism as an argument unless you're trying to create something entirely new and trying to be a separatist, which, to be honest, is an idea that I find appealing if it's, but I understand it's not politically viable at the moment.
Do you think it might become politically viable in the near future?
I sure hope so. Definitely.
I mean, just looking at, I guess, Twitter and such, there seems to be quite a lot of secessionist sentiment in some of the more rural areas like Alberta. But I'm not sure what the political ramifications of that really would be in terms of the practicality.
Well, yeah, I do think that there's people that would support it. The problem is that the idea that the global homo is going to allow a right-wing separatist country to just carve itself out of a Western country is just, at this point, they're going to, I mean, you have to understand that there's a reason that they're advocating mass immigration and trying to target these rural areas. The idea is to destroy you. It's not to separate from you. It's they want there to be no European countries that exist in the world. It's a project to destroy you. So they're not going to just allow you to separate. So in that respect, it's not politically viable yet, but hopefully in the future it is.
Yeah.
Do you think on the other path of that, it would be, I mean, from the neoliberal perspective, it seems like they want to move more towards just a single North American bloc, where Mexico and Canada at least are more or less unified with the United States. Do you think that's a problem we might face in the near future?
Well, not really, because because I don't know how much it doesn't really already exist in a real sense. So I mean, they're already it already de facto is kind of like that. I mean, there's slightly different policies, but they're both global homo liberal democracies with the same policy, with very similar policies. So I don't know. I don't know if they're going to go straight for that. But the idea is, though, they're not going to give up control over a plot of land to a right-wing regime. That's the idea is to snuff you out globally. So
if the right wing mobilizes, we can decrease the incentive to pull these shenanigans. If the left starts feeling that it's not going to get an immediate boost by trying to play transnational shenanigans with populations, then it might be less incentivized to push for these things. Although, I am not so sure how much power we have to really prevent that, to sort of organize at the level where that wouldn't be a boon for the left wing, I guess. I don't know. I mean, it's something that I've thought a lot about. I mean, it's very obvious that the left wing does not feel threatened by Islam in Britain, and it never has, right? Which, when you think about it that way, it's sort of amazing that there was ever this sort of counter jihad movement because it was obvious that the people who had power and knowledge weren't afraid of these people and weren't afraid of them growing independent ideology that was counter-progressive and traditionalist in any way.
Oh yeah, because like Islam isn't in if we want to use the UK as an example, it's entirely just used as a hammer against the white population. It's not in any way going to actually gain power for itself, because the cathedral, if you want to call it that, will never let that happen. You know, they'll let the Muslims have their their polygamous marriages, their Sharia in their little community. They're never going to allow them to actually hold any real political power that they don't control. And I mean,
you can't opt out of the gay indoctrination.
Yeah.
Jess Phillips, right?
Yeah, and the goal is eventually to just turn the Muslims into, globo homo liberals who, instead of hating you for not being Muslim, they hate you for being white. So,
in an ideal world, I'm not saying this is possible. In an ideal world, the left would be much more cautious about doing this, because they would be worried about creating another right-wing coalition member, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
But I am not so sure. It's very questionable, global wealth being how it is, if any third world population would have more to gain with allying from the right than they would have just looting the coffers on these large sort of globalistically minded Western countries who just print money for everything they want, right?
Yeah, one of the best videos someone ever made on that was Horace, the video against Brian and Avi. It's an excellent video, essentially showing who really is behind creating all these Muslim power groups, and these groups that are essentially advance that agenda. And I'm not going to say exactly who they are, but they're not Muslim. It's kind of the same story in America with a lot of these Black Power organizations that they. I wish that Frame Game was still around. He had done a great series on essentially how those are set up, and you can't make the mistake of thinking that that group is something that you can take away from. You can peel off from the left coalition because, I don't know, they don't like homosexuality or something like that, because you see the left has so much control over them because they essentially allow them to have that kind of power.
Yeah, I think the sort of fundamental reason why Muslims will always be left-wing within Western societies is both Muslims and progressives are revolutionary forces. They're both seeking to change Western societies into something that is very fundamentally different from what the West is currently, or what it at least has been historically. So neither of them feel a connection to any sort of deep traditions, which is mostly the basis of the right.
Yeah, exactly. They're not trying to conserve Western civilization, really. So they can't really be conservative in any real sense in a Western context.
Or perhaps even right wing. I mean, this sort of gets down to the bio-Leninist end game, so to speak, is that the main innovation of the left through the 20th century is they've found a way to manufacture loyalty in a loyaltyless society by converting need into loyalty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the more you need, the more loyal you'll be. And this is a really dynamite, and I don't know what the solution to this is quite yet. It's something that I think a lot about, but it's something that is. This is what essentially generates the left's stranglehold on all of this, right? Because every crisis is a chance for them to manufacture a new group that will support, that will be more loyal to them than ever before. And because of that, their structure is one where they can play a mercenary game against the right, and then they can play loyalty-based politics with themselves, which is what all movements want to do, right? Ordinarily, this kind of game would just destroy the society itself around it, which is why no one did them in the past. But I'm not so sure how we disrupt this game. It's something that I think is just an open question for the right now.
Well, as far as attempting to disrupt it goes, I mean, there's certainly ways we can exploit the chaotic nature of the system to try and convince people to reimpose, concepts of law and order. I mean, when you consider how the actual proper Leninist structure in the Soviet Union broke down, it's basically because it simply wasn't able to provide the level of civilization that Eastern Europeans or Russians wanted to live in. And if the bio-Leninist paradigm continues to degrade Western civilization proper, there might be some opportunity there for us to exploit the inability of the system to really build anything you would call civilization and propose some sort of counter to that. Of course, in the European context, the Eastern European countries had the advantage of being able to fall back on their existing national identity, right? Which we don't really have at this point.
Yeah, I'd say also that it breeds incompetence. So, you can only have so many diversity hires until you're just unable to get anything done. Eventually, when you're just putting incompetent people into positions of power, eventually it's going to come back and bite you. And it hasn't. I think you're only kind of starting to see the beginnings of that. But I wonder how long that can actually last. If the right wing is full of much more competent people, I definitely think that is a way to attack the kind of bio-Leninist structure, because its power is also one of its weaknesses, in that it by gaining power, it essentially puts power in the hands of people who are just completely incompetent. Really,
well, the left wing has those people, and they also have mercenaries. And in our very mercantile world, the very, very competent people are all entirely mercenary. So people are just in it for the power. You want to be on the left, right? That's the other end of the bio-Leninist formula, right?
But how long can it really be until the left kind of turns on the mercenaries, though, due to their own ideology?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that and I have to go in a few minutes because I told myself I wouldn't be on for more than 2 hours. But I mean, we kind of come full circle here, right? Because the right in Europe, they can fall back on their national identity, and that's good. That's going to make it easier for them now. But eventually, we're going to have it out with the left on an international scale, and the right's going to have to come up with. It's going to have to come up with a narrative that's fundamentally international and that fundamentally can operate in the most chaotic, mixed up, dare I say, cocked or paused places imaginable. Because leftism can work anywhere, right? That's always the thing, right? Rightism has a hard time working in confused, disorderly areas. Leftism can work in Sweden before it was when it was completely homogenous, right? But I don't think there's nothing necessary about that arrangement. And I think that in North America, you say it. Well, I mean, I get the same. Someone said that Canada feels like a hotel, and I've had to say California increasingly feels like a hotel too. I'm just with this whole generational thing. I felt when I was a child that there was a California that my maternal grandfather had known, and I was kind of receiving that. But now I just have no idea what California. I mean, I have an idea that California is going to be some kind of decultured free trade zone. It looks like a combination of L.A. and Shanghai and Mexico City, but maybe richer, but also more squalid. I don't know, right? But there's not going to be any kind of identity that it has in common with previous generations. All the particularism is going to be drained out. But for those of us who find ourselves in those situations. The sort of next quest, the next innovation on the right is how do you create sort of a truly postmodern right-wing community inside a larger society that appears to be totally valueless and totally mercenary and totally globalized? Does it look like something like micro patchwork? Does it look like something like secret societies, or as Curtis Yarvin put it, does it look like some kind of cult? What does a right-wing community look like that can survive in a completely inhospitable environment? And if that right wing can kind of symbiotically link up with the nationalist right wing, that would be a dynamite combination, because it would communicate to the progressive order that the right wing isn't going anywhere, right? Like, you can turn everywhere into California and we'll still be here, right?
I think I actually have an idea of what that would look like. Kind of like, dare I say, the ADL and the State of Israel.
No, I think there's something to that, but I don't think it necessarily has to go in that direction, right?
Well, I think, like, in terms of like working in hostile environments, like say California or Toronto or Vancouver or something like that, it would I think best work as like an interest group.
Yeah, no, I mean, Israel's a perfect example of how you can hook in an internationalist front end to a nationalist back end, and that's what makes it so successful, right? Like,
yeah, and
that model,
the best model, to be honest.
well, it's certainly something to start from, right? Like, if you can learn from that, right? And just as in Israel, Israel itself is a separatist traditionalist. I mean, the separatist traditional, Israel's two nations. It's one separatist traditionalist society that has an incredibly high birth rate, to the point where Muslims can't keep up with them, right? And then it's a technocratic society on the other, and one side uses the other as a farm league. I mean, it's brilliant, right? Like, it's sort of like it's like a cultural entropy pump almost, right?
Yeah, I feel like we've touched on something really interesting there.
But unfortunately, guys, I have to duck out. But thank you so much for having me, Settlers Lament. I hope I didn't.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything last we like to touch on?
I don't really have anything else in particular to say. If there's anything else you guys would like to talk about, that's fine.
No, I think we covered a whole heck of a lot of topics. I think it was a good stream.
Yeah, this was a good run through. I do feel like this front end back end analogy with Israel is kind of interesting, though, and that's a topic that perhaps could use a bit more thought dedicated to it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That is kind of like using the interest groups in foreign lands, but then kind of having your own kind nationalism in your own land. And we know that these things can get really dicey, but it is a strategy that works for a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, it isn't even just an Israeli thing. I mean, there's very similar things with, say, the Chinese.
Or Turkey also.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it really is, and it's. I also see parallels with sort of 18th century or 19th century imperialism, like the idea that that British subjects anywhere on the globe have British protection. But yeah, I feel like here's is a good place to end off this stream. So thank you everyone thank you Charlemagne, Endeavour, and the Distributist for being here. And everyone, please make sure to subscribe to all those people if you aren't already, and make sure to subscribe to me. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.